Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Moore, and I'm the Executive Director of People, Not Politicians. And you are tuning in today for a webinar or video about redistricting in Oklahoma, the process that's happening this year, this spring, over the next few months, and how you can be involved today, tomorrow, and during this whole process. We want to help shine some light on the process from the outside. This is a legislative process this year, but that doesn't mean that we, the people, can't and shouldn't be involved. Redistricting is about us. It is about where we live. It's about ensuring that we have fair and free elections. And to do that, we, the people, must be involved. We can't just leave it up to the politicians. We all know how that's going to go. So today we're going to walk through some slides. I'll share those right now, and then we'll kind of go from there. Okay, so I'll be up in the corner of your screen and talking through these slides for the next few minutes. This should only take 45 minutes to an hour, hopefully. And we will send out additional information. If you're watching this live, you'll get an email in the next few days. All right, so again, People Not Politicians, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose purpose is to help educate you about redistricting, how to participate in public meetings, especially those dealing with redistricting, and then some additional ways you can be involved, sharing your information, your stories about your community, so that the legislators have all the information they need to, in theory, draw districts that are fair and representative of the people of this state. So we're going to start with a brief overview of the redistricting process. Redistricting, in case you don't already know, is the process of redrawing all of the state legislative and congressional districts. This is happening all across the country in every state. It is constitutionally required by the U.S. Constitution, and each state handles it a little bit differently. Here in Oklahoma, it is done by the state legislature up until now. That may change in the future if we have anything to say about it. But for right now, it is done as a legislatively drawn process. It happens every 10 years after the census is done, with the intent, the purpose being that all of our districts have to be redrawn to ensure equal population among them, right? And that ensures that everyone's vote carries equal weight. The idea of one person, one vote that is very important to our democracy. And this happens because, over the course of 10 years, people move around. Babies are born, people die, and that redistribution or that shuffling of population means that people move away from one area and move to a different area, and that they would have different size populations. And so in theory, if your district lost people, then you are, instead of being one of 40,000, maybe you're one of 20,000 people in that district. And so you could have an outsized impact on shaping policy or being represented in in the state legislature. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's the premise behind this. And so based on the census data every 10 years, the 435 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and Congress are redistributed among states based on their population. And then within each state, those district lines have to be redrawn to ensure that there are an even number of people or an equal number of people in all the districts. Oklahoma has 5 congressional districts. That has been the case. That is not expected to change after the census data is released this year. And so each of those districts will need to have roughly 800,000 people. Now, the process actually calls for those districts to be equal to the specific number of people, but we don't yet have the final census data to know what that number is. In addition to the congressional districts, we have 101 state house districts and 48 state senate districts. You can see on your screen here roughly what those numbers will be coming out to. Each house district will have about 40,000 people. Each senate district will have roughly 82,000 people. Again, until we have the final census data here in a few months, we won't know what those numbers actually are. So a quick look at some maps. I pulled all of these from Dave's Redistricting, which is an excellent website. You can go to davesredistricting.org, I think, It's very helpful. I'll talk about that more later. So these are the maps as they are right now. These are the maps that were drawn 10 years ago in 2011, and that will be redrawn here in the next few months. So you can see the 5 congressional districts. This map is the 48 state Senate districts, and this map is the 101 state House districts. Now, these are obviously very complicated maps, and we're not able to zoom in and look at them during this slideshow. But if you go to Dave's Redistricting, you can look at those maps. They also have them on the State House Redistricting website, which is a great resource as well. And I will share that link with you later on or via email afterwards. It's also a very great resource. And I encourage you, especially if you live in Oklahoma City or Tulsa or, Lawton, Stillwater, Ardmore, some of those areas that are even up at Enid, right? Like they've got Enid's an interesting little nugget up there in northwest part of the state. But you might have to zoom in to really look at where these district lines are. And to the extent that you're interested, look at how House districts and Senate districts line up or don't line up. They've made some comments about how they're going to approach that this year. I'm really interested to see how it actually happens. Again, at every level here, right? So these 5 congressional districts, these 48 Senate districts, or these 101 House districts have to maintain equal number of people across each of those types of maps. And so that's why you get big districts in the rural areas and tiny districts in the urban areas, because it has to do with population density, right? So right now we're looking at the state house map, 101 districts. Each of those districts has roughly 38,500 people. So for District 61 in the Panhandle, that's a much larger district because there's not a very densely populated area, as opposed to, here in the metro, you can't even see, House District 88 where I live in the middle of Oklahoma City, because it is pretty compact. It's a pretty densely populated area. So looking at the change and what we know so far, this map is from the Census Bureau. These are population estimates and the number of the change over the last 10 years, roughly 9 years. And so this is not the final numbers. Those have not been released, but this gives us an idea of where people are moving to and where they're moving from. You can see right away, Oklahoma County has gained roughly 80,000 people. I've heard new estimates since then. It may be closer to 90,000. Canadian County, also Cleveland County, also a big gain. Tulsa County, those are the big gainers. And then there's a few others, right? There's a few counties that gained, around 5,000 or 8,000 or something, 6,000. And then there's a whole bunch of counties that lost folks, and they may only have lost a few, a few dozen or a few hundred. Some counties lost several thousand, right? And so if you look at like these 3 counties or parts of the state, you can see where population has decreased more dramatically than maybe in other parts of the state. And so because of that, that means that districts in those areas will have to pick up people and have to kind of grow in size to get more population. And the districts in the urban areas will have to shrink. So have to shed population to help that rebalancing. And this trend is happening across the country, right? We are seeing nationwide a trend towards folks moving from rural areas to suburban and urban areas. And that is definitely reshaping how maps get drawn. And it's a challenging process. And it means that legislatures or commissions or whomever is drawing the maps need to be very sensitive and make a point to listen and have a conversation, a back and forth dialogue with constituents, with people who live in these states, to make sure that they are drawing lines, yes, to balance out population, but also that it doesn't disenfranchise any groups or individual voters to the extent possible. So here's how the process is done in Oklahoma right now. The Census Bureau will provide information on the actual data on population and race at the county, the census tract, the precinct, block levels, and census blocks and block groups. So they provide all that data, and it is like demographic data. So gender, age, races, that kind of stuff. They take that data, and combine it with other data that they could, right? So voter registration, voting history, where incumbents live, historical shapes of districts or district cores, those kinds of things. And then they use that with this high-powered software. Both chambers in our legislature are using Maptitude this year. And they can prioritize what parameters are most meaningful to them, what they want to prioritize, and use the software to redraw districts. It allows them to manually move the lines and see in real time how it affects the partisanship of a district, and other factors, right? It shows the racial composition, the voting age population versus the just raw population numbers, those kinds of things. And then these new maps will be packaged into bills, and they will go through the legislative process. So they will go to, they've said they go through committee, but I think that's just the redistricting committees. And eventually they'll go to a floor vote. And once they are passed from the floor, they'll go to the other chamber, pass there, and then go to the governor's desk for signature. So there's a number of ways that we can be involved in that process. And we'll talk about the priorities. There are a few caveats that I want to acknowledge in this based on the redistricting meetings or town hall meetings that the legislature has been holding over the last month. So in item number 2 here, I say that they combine it with other data, and including, such as voter registration data. The legislature has said publicly that they are not requesting the data about voter registration from Maptitude, from the software company. And actually the way the data is released is the census data releases it. The folks that own Maptitude, the software company, they download all of it for the whole country. And then they basically provide it to the state legislatures. Well, they have to buy it, right? The whole package costs about $10,000 for all the maps and all the data that they want to collect. And the legislature has said that they are not requesting the voter registration data or the political data. Now, there's good and there's positives and negatives to that, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, I think. Well, maybe one of the next slides. So why your participation in this process matters is that redistricting should not be a partisan process. It should be about ensuring that you and your family and all, Oklahomans are fairly represented. It's about where we live. It's not about where they live. It's about ensuring, one person, one vote, and that our elections that we hold in our democracy as being, the core of what we do, that they are fair and free. It's important for you to participate because your perspective of you, your organization, your community, that perspective matters. And if you don't share it or you don't participate, then they can't weigh that or include that in their conversations. And your participation matters because you can better inform policymakers and your community about this very important process. It only happens once every 10 years. And so now's our chance. We've got to be involved and pay attention. Things will move quickly, and there will be a limited amount of time for us to act and intervene and have a say in this. And it is, again, super important. And if you are involved, by being involved, you can help attract attention from your friends and neighbors to this process. And that helps, raise awareness so that more folks can be involved. We want everyone to be involved, not less. And, by talking about it enough, who knows, maybe you'll gain some press coverage, which again, just helps spread awareness about this issue even further. And it helps position you or your colleagues, your organization, your community to advocate about this issue and about other issues in the future. Because again, this is ultimately about representation. So the legislature has pledged to do the following things: hold public meetings, which they've been doing. They've done a series of town hall meetings around the state, including one virtual one so far. They have another dozen or so scheduled this month, including one additional all virtual one on the 25th. The legislature has also pledged to allow the public to submit maps for consideration in addition, or in contrast to the maps that they will be drawing. However, they have said that this must be a statewide plan. So if you are talking about a Senate district, you can't just submit your Senate district. You have to submit all 48 Senate districts, a complete map. And that map has to be drawn in accordance with the Senate's rules, which they have not passed yet. So that makes it difficult. Same thing for the House. It must include all 101 House districts. And in order to be considered, and those maps have to be drawn in accordance with their rules and, assuring equal population in each district. It must use the 2020 census data, of course. That makes total sense. As I said, it must conform to the Senate's adopted guidelines, which once they adopt those, which should happen here in the next couple of weeks, it must be submitted in a compatible electronic format that can be imported into Maptitude. So you can't just draw it out with pen and paper or even any other, well, some of the other map drawing softwares. There's some free ones out there. You can use those to export the file and submit it to them. They haven't totally explained how to submit it. They've given email addresses, but they haven't been very clear about what that looks like. My hunch is the file size will be too big for the email. And so this is an area of concern for me because we will be submitting a set of maps that are drawn based on our criteria and our policy. They've also said they will provide ample notice to the public before maps are voted on, but they have not said what ample is or how the maps will be provided to us for review. We've seen in other states they would provide the maps a day in advance, and it wouldn't be a visual map. It would just be a set of coordinates for all the points around, which is just impossible, right? It's like a 300-page document with essentially GPS coordinates, right? Or longitude and latitude coordinates outlining the districts. And that, I'm telling you, that is not an acceptable way to provide the maps to the public for consideration, especially not when they're requesting us to submit it in an electronic format that can be imported into Maptitude. Those maps should be made available in the same, on the same GIS websites that they use to share the maps that are already passed. Now, all three of these things, all three bullet points, require us, you and I, and everybody else, to be involved, right? Holding public meetings doesn't mean diddly if we don't show up. Allowing us to submit maps don't mean diddly if we don't submit any. And providing notification to us that they're going to vote on maps doesn't mean diddly if we don't look at the maps and provide some feedback. So the onus is on us here too, right? They need to do the right thing, but we also have to do the right thing and to show up. So here are the priorities and principles that they've outlined so far and how that lines up against what we outlined in our policy when we had filed our ballot initiative last year to create an independent commission. Obviously, equal population is an important issue. That's constitutionally required. Compactness, how compact a district is, that's another item. Preservation of political units, so it'd be like city limits, county borders, those kinds of things. Historical precedents, meaning what the districts have looked like over the past cycle or two or three. Some have changed more than others over the years, right? Economic and political interests, or this is often referred to as communities of interest. That's the term that I typically use. And so meaning that, your neighborhood or your community there, whether it's a neighborhood, maybe it's a bunch of neighborhoods, maybe it's a cultural area, right, that reflect a particular ethnic group. Maybe it's a bunch of folks that all have horses and it's kind of a equine focused or an arts community or whatever. However it is that you define your community where you live, that is your community of interest. One example might be several small towns that are in close proximity to one another and that they often have the same issues and kind of advocate for the same things, that they should be included in one district, or they should be divided between two districts, those kinds of things. Contiguous territory, meaning that a district has to have contiguity. It can't be in two separate pieces, like spread out. That one seems obvious, but it's got to be in there. And then other major factors, what they have not yet defined. You will notice on their list, and this is where I was going to mention it, they have not said that they will be including voter registration data, or like the partisan leaning of a district, or the partisan composition of a district. And they've said that because uh, I don't know. One, because we've been harping on it. However, by uh, not overtly including political data and choosing to ignore it means that they very well could be ignoring important aspects of a district, right? That if there is a group of Republicans who live in an area that's a staunch Republican area, if they divide them up, that group might feel like that was discriminatory or somehow diluted their voice, right? Likewise, by including a bunch of Democrats in one district and excluding them from other districts, that could be construed as packing them into one district to make it a very Democratic district, which might make the districts around it less competitive, right? And so there's something to be said for having competitive districts where the balance of Republican and Democrat, or whatever two parties are in an area, or however many parties, that the competitiveness of that district um, tends to yield better candidates and pass better legislation. So when we look across the country at districts and states that are more competitive, we tend to see them passing more responsible, more ethical, and better legislation, and governing better overall, which is what most voters want, right? Like, we want a government that works. So another thing that they have mentioned, but they have not, I haven't put on this list yet, is considering where incumbents live, meaning the people in office who are drawing the districts have, essentially, politicians are drawing their own districts, right? They're involved in the process. And so they are going to make sure that they don't draw themselves out of a district. And this one's a little tricky because they have said it that they're going to consider that in years past. This year they've hedged on that because they don't want to upset members of their chamber, right? They don't want to draw someone out of their district because it's a bad look, and it's just bad form. It's bad politics between them. However, by considering where incumbents live, isn't that drawing districts based on where someone who is in there for a temporary amount of time, as opposed to drawing them fairly to represent the people who just live there, right? Like, why does one person who may not even be in office 2 years from now, why should they be considered over just the public? So that's something to pay close attention to. For us, going through our policy, these are in order. The legislature priorities I've not ranked in any particular order because they've not been very clear about what they're prioritizing. For us, these were in a prioritized order. So compliance with federal law, right off the top, obviously. Equal population, and that means equal when it comes to congressional districts, plus or minus 5% when it comes to state house, state senate. And that variance allows them to draw lines and not be forced to have to break up neighborhoods or those kinds of things. And honestly, 5% on 40,000 people isn't that many people overall. Contiguity, districts must be contiguous, as we said earlier. And then, to the extent possible, maximizing compliance with the following: racial and ethnic fairness. So not being discriminatory towards any particular group. This also addresses the first bullet point of compliance with federal law, which particularly the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that ensures that ethnic minority groups are drawn into districts where they can comprise the majority of voters there, with the hope or the intent that they would have a better shot at electing someone from their community. Those are called minority majority districts. It's a very important thing. Reflecting communities of interest, which we mentioned a moment ago. And later on in this presentation, we'll talk about how you can submit your community of interest so that that information is included. Respecting political subdivisions, again, cities, counties, those kinds of things. Compactness. So obviously, how compact a district is not necessarily reflective of how good it is. Although a very non-compact, meandering district tends to be more gerrymandered because they're trying to connect disparate parts of the state into the same district. But sometimes you get a big, sprawling district, like out in western Oklahoma, because population density is very low and you have to have a lot of land to catch everybody, to catch enough folks to fit your district. Our policy also says that you should not disproportionately advantage either party. And so in a district where it would be competitive, you should not draw lines to unduly favor one party or the other. And that you should not include or consider where incumbents live, because again, they very well may be out of office in 2 years or 4 years, but these districts are going to be around for 10. And so we should not be considering that. So this is the timeline as far as we know, and this has been fluid to some degree. The legislature is doing these town hall meetings last month and this month. Today is organizational day, where they are meeting for the the unofficial first day of the legislative session to agree on rules, elect their leaders, that kind of stuff. The session actually starts on February 1st. And then they will be drawing some maps, making some deals, talking about it based on estimated data, right? They can't finalize the maps until they get the official census data, and that constitutionally is supposed to be released by March 31st. I have heard some estimates that it would be as early as late February. However, the Census Bureau more recently has said it could be later, and that's because the whole process has been delayed by COVID. Once President-elect Biden is sworn in later in January, he could make some changes to it. I think, there's some allowances in there. If they don't have it ready for the states. They tend to release it in groups of states, like, here's a few states, and here's a few states, and here's a few states. But this year, they've said they're going to release all the states at once in one big data dump. And because of that, they have to kind of wait until all the state data is done. I'm not sure why they're doing it that way, but I believe, according to the Constitution, they have to have it out by the end of March. We'll see what happens. In the meantime, the legislature is drawing maps. Like, they are working on this. They're talking to their members. And what we've seen in other states, and arguably here in Oklahoma in decades past, is that while the legislature would be officially in charge of drawing maps, they would have a small team of folks offsite, in a hotel downtown or someone's office, drawing maps. And so they could do this whole public process, but then when it comes to actually passing maps, the ones that get passed, that get submitted at the last minute, are these ones that were drawn offsite, and they don't give members enough time to really review them. They ram it through and get them passed, and then we're stuck with those maps, unless there's a lawsuit, which has happened. So Governor Bellman sued the legislature based on some of the maps they'd drawn. So this is not unprecedented. Once they get the maps drawn, they do have to be passed by both chambers and signed by the governor. That will likely happen sometime in late April or early May. By the Constitution, they have to have it done by the end of May, which is sine die, which is when all the bills have to be passed, right? Now, then there's a question of special session, and that's a whole different ballgame. As we all know, there are a number of constitutionally required deadlines that the legislature habitually ignores. And I don't know why, other than there hasn't been a consequence for that. For example, historically, the Constitution said, well, for the last several decades, the Constitution said that the state legislature had to pass an education budget by April 1st, but they've only done it twice in the last 40 years. And so, but there was no consequence for not doing it. So we will be paying very close attention with our attorney on speed dial about these deadlines and how they are performing against them. Now, you and I can contribute this whole time, right? We can participate in the town hall meetings. We can talk to our individual members. We can talk to the committee members. We can share information, provide data, all that stuff throughout this process. And again, we really believe, people not politicians, that this should be a dialogue. It should be a back and forth. This is about the legislature drawing maps for all the people in Oklahoma. And they should not do that in a vacuum. They should do that in conversation with us. But we have to hold up our end of the conversation. Okay, so that was Redistricting 101. Now let's talk about how you can be a participant in the process. So we're going to talk about some of the elements of civil discourse, how to speak up. If you've never spoke in a public meeting before, or you're nervous about it, or emailed your state legislator or anything like that, we got you. Like, let me help you out. And we'll have more information about this coming out over the next few months. First of all, got to know yourself, man. Like, you got to know what you're good at, what your hot buttons are, what are the things they could do that would really upset you, how you best communicate. Are you good on your feet, or do you need to write out a script and read that? Are you better on the phone, in person, or on email? These are all things that can be helpful to know before you get into it, so you don't freeze up or get flustered, lock up, yell, shout, any of those things. As always, being respectful is very important. We all, as my grandma used to say, you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. Let's keep that in mind. Pay attention, particularly during some of these town hall meetings. For example, last night, I'm recording this and doing this live on January 5th, and right, that is the 5th. And the League of Women Voters held a town hall last night with a member of the House that was speaking about redistricting. And there were several good questions, but it was pretty clear that she did not know the answers and was not very familiar with the process, and was a little confused and confusing on several issues. And so by paying attention to the process and listening to what they're saying, one, you figure out who knows what's up and who doesn't. Two, you can learn more about the process, right? Sometimes people slip up and say things that they were not supposed to say. So don't just be attentive, but actually listen to what they're saying. Take notes if that's helpful, so that you can refer to them later. Follow-up questions. We're not trying to do anything that's like gotcha out there, but we do want the legislature to know that we are paying attention, that we are involved. And when we ask questions, they know who knows their stuff and who doesn't. And that usually leads to a better outcome for everybody. I really encourage you to be curious. Redistricting is fascinating. It only happens once every 10 years. It happens in every state with all these different processes. It has been somewhat secret for decades, literally 100 and something years. And we are really trying hard to drag this into the light and learn about it as much as we can. The process is complicated and difficult and is vitally important to our democracy. And so learning as much as you can and asking questions, whether it's from me or your legislators, whomever, do it. Like, it's fascinating. And if someone says they don't know and they'll find out, like, that's a good egg right there. If I don't know, I'll tell you, I'll try to find out for you. Because I'm usually, if I don't know it, then I'm aware of this huge gap and I want to know as much as I can about it. If you are speaking to a committee at one of these town hall meetings, be sure to focus on the issue at hand and try not to get distracted by something else. Sometimes I think we've all probably listened in on public meetings where they're discussing, let's say, redistricting, and then the next thing you know, someone is talking about tax policy, and that is maybe not the right point in time for that conversation. Let's bring it back and stay kind of focused on where we're at. When possible, when they provide evidence, such as example maps, historic maps, take a look at them. Don't just take it for granted. But, I've seen this presentation they've been giving with their town halls, and they're quickly flipping through maps and showing it, much like I did today. However, it is not my responsibility to dig into the maps and let people take a look at it. At the point in time at which they release maps, for us to review before they vote on them is going to be vitally important. You will likely get several emails from me if you're on our list during that time period. Hopefully it's more than 24 hours. I'm afraid that's what they're going to give us. Regardless, we've got to take time to examine what they put out there and then provide some constructive feedback, if at all possible. When you can, if you can provide evidence, such as submitting maps, even if it's just information about your community of interest, that is vitally important, and you should provide that as well. If you look back at historic maps and you can demonstrate where communities have been divided or cut unnecessarily, that's a big deal too, right? Like, that's evidence for them to be like, oh, well, we've been drawing it this way for the last 50 years because that's how the Democrats drew it, and we figured they wanted to keep it that way. Well, that just because the other party drew it one way doesn't mean it was right back then either, right? Like every 10 years we get a chance to redraw these lines. Someone should do it as fairly as possible and not just to ensure that they and their buddies get reelected, which is too often the case, or to try to stick it to the other team. Democracy shouldn't be a team sport like this. We're all devolving into this us versus them instead of recognizing that we are neighbors who live in one big complex community. Be constructive when you can. Find common ground. Again, we're all in this together. Let's try to get through it. So if you are attending one of these meetings in person or virtually, and you're planning to ask a question or speak, I always encourage folks to write out what you want to say. That's very important and can be very helpful. For one, that way you don't get flustered. Also, sometimes someone else asks a question or your question gets answered along the way. And so, being very clear in that is helpful. When you get up to speak or it's your turn on the Microsoft Team meeting or Zoom or whatever platform they're going to be using, identify yourself and where you're from. Always interested in what part of the state, just what city, right? Hey, I'm Andy Moore, I'm from Bethany, or I'm Denise, I'm from Enid, whatever it is. That's helpful to kind of reference it in some ways. If you know your district, you can always say that too. State your purpose. I have a question about this, or I support this part of what you're doing, or I oppose this. I oppose you considering incumbents in this. Or also just, I have a question. Why do you think it's important to do this? Or, what's the benefit of doing it this way as opposed to a different way? Last night on the league's town hall, I saw someone ask, why is the legislature doing this and instead of an independent commission? And I think they clarified to say, would you support there being an independent commission in charge of redistricting moving forward? So interesting perspectives. Be brief, right? Like no one likes someone who's rambling. Just get to the point, ask your question or say your statement and move along. Be courteous, give facts and evidence if possible. If you've got visual aids, providing copies of those, if you're in person, that kind of stuff can be helpful. If you've got a personal story, often that kind of thing resonates better than just the data. As an example, the example I typically share about this is that last fall, we did a statewide town hall tour as well, talking to folks about our initiative petition. And when we were in McAllister, we met McAllister or Ada? I'm pretty sure it was McAllister. There was a woman who talked about her and her daughter lived across the street from one another, and someone they knew was running for the state house. And they were both excited and they campaigned for and had signs and, very excited. And then they went to go vote. And only one of them had this friend on the ballot. And it wasn't until election day that they figured out that the line between two house seats ran right down the middle of their street. And so one could vote for their friend and the other one couldn't. And they were devastated and then very confused and really started asking questions of like, how did this line end up here in the middle of the neighborhood, dividing us from one another? Like, these are my neighbors. I see them literally when I walk out the door. How did this happen? And started asking questions and found out that the lines had been moved in the previous redistricting because a representative lived outside of town, wanted to move into town so his kids could attend a school in town. But if he had moved, he would have moved out of his district. So he waited until redistricting and then, asked his colleagues to help shift that line a couple of miles down the road so that he would pick up some extra population. They could lose some somewhere else, and that would allow him to move into the neighborhood he wanted to live in. And so again, that was a good example of how considering where incumbents live or where they're going to live can be detrimental to the population actually getting represented in a fair way. It's helpful to frame your position with how it will benefit the community and beyond, right? So not just how it benefits you, but saying like, drawing it to reflect this community of interest keeps this group together, right? Dividing Cherokee County 5 ways is detrimental to the Cherokee Nation and detrimental to the state for X, Y, and Z reasons. So framing it with what problem will it solve? What benefit will it create? Those are all ways to kind of frame up your argument that can be really helpful. And then during the meeting, if you can go first, that's often helpful to kind of set the tone for the rest of the comments or questions. If there's a mic, make sure that you adjust it so that you can be heard, identify yourself, deliver your statement or question. If someone else has already made the same point, that's okay. You can still speak. You don't have to, but it's okay to also say, hey, I just want to, he said what I was going to say, but I want to agree and, ratify that and say, this is a very important issue. If you have any visual aids, maps, other data, be sure to have those ready, provide copies, share however you can. You can always email that stuff in. And then when you conclude, restate your position, right? If relevant. It's like the old military adage of tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them, right? 3 times. That repetition helps it stick. After the meeting, again, be courteous. Thank the hosts for their time and attention. These town hall meetings are around the state. That means that legislators are having to drive around in the evenings, hang out for a couple of hours, and it may be far away from their home where they're at, and that's a sacrifice they have to make. That's important and certainly worthy of our appreciation. If there's members of the press there, they can't be everywhere, but sometimes I like to talk to them to get their feedback of just like, hey, did my question make sense earlier? And that also gives them the opportunity to ask follow-up questions. They're often kind of a third-party observer that is trained to kind of try to see both sides of an issue and to tell stories from both sides, and they can be helpful. And also that gives you the chance that they may want to include a quote from you or your example, and that again can help spread awareness about redistricting, not necessarily to try to shift any individual policy, but just like let people know that this process is happening and you can be involved. Look, here's how this person did it. And then even if they're not there, talking about it on social media. If you attend these meetings, post about it on Facebook. Like say, hey, last night I went to Ada to this town hall meeting and Senator McCourtney was leading it and it was great. He was very helpful. They provided a bunch of information. We asked a few questions, but they didn't really pause and ask us much, right? They said they wanted to get feedback, but they never asked us anything. They just kind of said, are there questions? And I wasn't sure what to ask because they kind of wrapped it up in a bow. And so, or maybe it's another way. They showed up, they were in and out, they were not talkative at all. Or they hung out with us for an hour afterwards and really answered a bunch of individual questions. That kind of feedback is very valuable to people and helps people understand that the legislature is much more accessible than a lot of us realize. So a few opportunities that are coming up for you to participate. One are the town hall meetings. Again, there were some last month and some this month. You can attend and participate in person. You can also watch them online. They are live streaming, most of them. And they will have, as I said, another all virtual one on January 25th. The dates and locations for those meetings are on the House and Senate redistricting websites. We have also created a map. And so it is on our website and I will send it out to everyone who participated here. You'll get an email later this week. If you're watching this after the fact, I'll put the link to it down in the description so you can click on it there. You can submit questions to the House Redistricting Office. It's all nonpartisan staff. They're all pretty great. The email address is redistrictoklahoma2020@okhouse.gov. The Senate's email address is redistricting@oksenate.gov. And you can send questions to those or just reach out to your individual House rep or state senator and tell them, and then they can relay that internally to the members of the committee as well. For the House, all 101 members are on the redistricting committee. They're divided into regional subcommittees, but every member is on the redistricting committee. And so that's a great way to be involved. And then you can also draw your district or your community of interest, more precisely, using this tool called Representable. And so I'm going to show you all about that right now. Maybe not all about it, but I'm going to give you a crash course in it. And then in the next few days, we will be sharing a video that's a bit more of an in-depth explanation for how to use it. It's very self-explanatory. I think you can figure it out. If you navigated to this video today, then you can figure out Representable. It's free open source tool that is designed for creating maps of communities of interest. Now, again, those are groups of individuals who share a common social or economic interest, and who would likely to have similar political ideology or concerns at least, but who might not be reflected on other maps, right? And so it's neighborhoods, again, like cultural communities, racial, ethnic groups, things like that, that might not be reflected in existing maps, like city maps and those kinds of things. It was created by some folks, very smart folks at Princeton University and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And they did it in concert with people like me and groups like us across the country, right? So we have a big group listserv. We have big group Zoom meetings to talk about the tool itself, like the website, how it's working, how it's not, what success we've had with it, features we'd like to see added. And we've been able to use it as it's evolved over the last year. In fact, I got an email yesterday with a bunch of new features that I need to check out. So right now, communities of interest are used in, one of three ways. In some cases, map drawers ignore communities of interest. In some cases, map drawers themselves define those communities of interest, which is basically kind of what happens with the legislature when they're the ones drawing the maps. Or a third option, and we are advocating for, is that communities themselves define their community of interest, provide that information to the map drawers, and the map drawers listen to what those look like. It's very important. So that's what we're aiming for here. How Representable works, it asks you some very simple but thought-provoking questions based around the policy and legal definition of a community of interest. So you just answer kind of like, basically, what is it? Like, why are you drawing the map this way? What is this community? What do they have in common? Then you draw it. Then you can see it and you can export the file. And what we're doing here with Representable is collecting this information from as many people as we can get to submit, and then we can export the file, and I will share it towards the end of March with the legislature, and they will be able to put it in Maptitude as like a layer in the map, so they can overlay the data and see these communities of interest. And ideally, it'll help inform them to make sure that they draw districts that don't like just divide it. And in fact, the software has a feature, according to the software company, where it will like flag them if they are dividing a community of interest. So they can specify in there that. It's a really great feature. So we've got about a 3-minute video about Representable. This video is a few months old, and so some of the features have changed a wee bit, but this provides a good explanation.
And therefore might benefit from cohesive representation. COIs are critical for the upcoming redistricting cycle. Over 26 states now have legal requirements to respect COIs in the redistricting process, yet no methods exist to vet data on where COIs are located and what their shared interests are to map makers. That's why we created Representable.org, to create a platform to collect and share standardized large-scale COI data to add more public input into the map drawing process. We want to help civic organizations work towards a more fair process and ensure underrepresented communities have a voice. Representable was created by a team of Princeton engineers, lawyers, and civic partners. It's a free open source tool for all to use. The digital survey tool is a standardized, easy to understand form that we developed in collaboration with policy organizations. This includes a community questionnaire and mapping tool. The questionnaire was designed to help users understand what map makers are looking for in describing COIs and give them relevant questions and examples so they can best describe their communities. This includes shared economic and social interests and community services. The mapping tool allows users to draw their communities using an interface very similar to Google Maps. Users can draw and edit their communities in great detail to best represent it. The census blocks within their communities are highlighted and saved alongside their community maps. community mapping drive is a way for organizations to collect, organize, and manage COI maps. Organizations can create multiple community mapping drives with different sets of volunteers. Once volunteers map their communities on Representable, organizations can analyze and share custom community maps. The platform offers interactive and easy to understand map visualizations. Organizations can highlight specific data or look at aggregate views and overlay different data layers to get a better understanding of the maps. It is possible to easily export and share the data with other people and tools. You can download individual or collective maps as GeoJSON files to have the data be interoperable with other mapping software, or download a PDF for easy sharing. We are working on expanding sharing capabilities to curate maps and analysis based on the needs of organizations at mapmakers.
Representable is already working with partner organizations in Michigan, Virginia, Texas, and Illinois to collect data and constantly iterate on our product based off of feedback from our organizational partners. We're growing fast and focusing on forming close relationships with organizations to cater to their data collection and policy needs. We hope that you'll join us to mobilize communities to get the representation they deserve.
All right. Now there we go. Sorry about the sound. I think I forgot to share the audio, but I figured it out. So that video is from sometime in 2019, I think. They've added a ton more states. There's 20 something states, I think, that are have been actively using this. We are one of them. So how to do it yourself, how to go on. You can go to representable.org/drive/people not politicians with hyphens in there. And I will send you this link in an email so you don't have to write it all down now, but you can if you'd like. You scroll to the bottom and you click the button that says Draw My Community. You sign up, you put in your name and email address and that kind of stuff, and then you start drawing. And it's really intuitive. As you saw in the video, you can do it a couple of ways. You can kind of draw just with your mouse as a circle, and it'll highlight all of the census blocks and block groups. And even now, the most latest version. So here's the sign up thing. You put in your name and address because they want to find out who you are and make sure that you actually live in the place. This information is not publicly shared. It will go into our drive, but I'm the only one that can see that. Then you answer these shared questions or these questions about shared interests. You have to pick one. So economic interest, community activities and services, cultural, historic interests. And so I also encourage you to click those things that say show examples because they give really good examples that are helpful. And that's really useful. And then when you draw it, when you are moving your mouse around now, you can adjust the size of the selection tool, but it automatically shades census blocks or block groups, depending how big of the tool you have selected. And so as you move your cursor across the map, it changes the size. For one, this is fascinating to see what the census blocks are, because in a urban area, it's typically like city blocks, more or less. And a block group is a collection of two or more blocks. But when you get into rural areas, and you can see on this map that even as you move out, so this right now is showing Bethany, and this census block, I think this is a block group of 2 or 3 census blocks. It is certainly not all of Bethany, but it all of Wiley Post Airport is in there, and then this other community, this neighborhood out west there. But as you move up to the top left, which is the northwest of the map, you can see some of the lines of the census blocks. They get much bigger because it's more of a rural area. And so understanding what that looks like and how those things have to be included. And so that helps give some guidance about why some districts have wonky edges, because that's what the census blocks look like. And it's interesting here, it's real helpful in the metro to kind of see how that's done. And it's helpful in rural areas as well. So It's a really intuitive tool. And once you pick it, you've already named it and said why, and then it goes into like a shared folder where we can view them. And as the video said, we can export that and send it to the legislature. All right. That is the bulk of what I have to share today. If you have any questions, please drop them into the chat real quick. And I'll give you a moment to type with a few dates coming up, and we'll go back to just me. So a few things coming up are the state legislative town hall meetings. And here we go. We'll share the map to that in the chat right now. If I can find a way to do it. Here we go. That should get you the map that has all of the meetings that are coming up. It has the ones from December as well. So you can click on the little placeholders for each one, and it'll show you the location, the date and time for all of those. And I think they start tomorrow this week, and there's roughly 10 that are happening this month, 8 or 10. And then again, on January 25th will be the next virtual one. We will be sharing that information. They've put the link up on the Senate website, and well, it was in a press release. So we'll be sharing that as well. In fact, I'll give you a link to that press release so you can see it right now. And I hope that you will participate. If you have questions about redistricting along the way, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is andy@letsfixthis.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Our website is peoplenotpoliticians.org. We've got some of these resources there, information. We will keep you as up to date as I possibly can about this process. We're kind of in a lull where they're doing these town hall meetings. I've listened in to almost all of them, and it is interesting to hear what's the same in each one, and also the little things that are slightly different. And so please keep being involved in that. And without any further questions, I'll bid you adieu. Have a good lunch, and have a great rest of the month.